I want to draw your attention to the screens as we get started here today. I finally had a preaching sub who recognized my genius in theological. I'm just kidding, that's a joke. On a more serious note, but still lighthearted, my son turned 6 years old today, and he's been asking me all morning if I was going to mention him in the sermon. And so there's like no pressure, but a lot of pressure. So I just felt like I needed to do that. Happy birthday, Dax. Good job, bud. 6. Yeah, that's cool. Grab your Bibles, open to Matthew chapter 24. We're going to pick up in verse 15. As you turn, though, I want to sort of do a big picture review. I want to make sure we understand sort of what's happening from a macroscopic level, from 30,000 feet, because really what's happening specifically in this passage does not make sense unless we understand that. Jesus has entered Jerusalem for the last week of his earthly life. It's Wednesday of that week. On Friday, 2 days from now, he will be crucified on the cross. On Tuesday, the day prior, Jesus cruised into town and he cleansed the temple. You remember, he comes in, he starts flipping over the tables, drives out the money changers and buyers and sellers. That'll happen Tuesday. Tuesday evening, Jesus goes back to Bethany, spends the night at the home of his good friends Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And then Wednesday morning, he comes back into the city, goes back into the temple for a full day of teaching. And when I say a full day of teaching, I mean a full day. It's 2.5 chapters in the Gospel of Matthew of Jesus teaching. That all happens on Wednesday in the temple. And for all 2.5 of those chapters, Jesus rebukes the unfaithfulness of the nation of Israel. Just over and over again, in a variety of ways and through a variety of stories and parables and instructions, Jesus says, "You have been unfaithful as a nation." He compares them in Matthew chapter 21, verses 18 to 22, to a fruitless fig tree, as he sort of highlights their inauthentic relationship with God. He likens them to tenants who seize their master's land, kill their master's servants, and then even murder the master's son. He says they have received an invitation to come to the master's wedding banquet, to God's wedding banquet for his son, and they refuse that invitation. And so now God will choose to invite other guests. He turns this question they ask him about taxes, a question meant to trap Jesus in between the people and what they thought and the government and what they thought. And Jesus takes that question and he flips it around on them and indicts them for their unwillingness to give their entire lives to God. And then Jesus spends all of chapter 23 lamenting this people, lamenting the nation of Israel through a series of woe statements. Remember, we went through those. Woe to you, he says, teachers of the law, Pharisees, you hypocrites. Woe to you. And he exposes their hollow, outward-focused religion that has nothing on the inside. And then finally, at the end of chapter 3, at the end of this 2.5 chapter sort of indictment, Jesus says this to them. This is chapter 23, verse 38. "Look, your house is left to you desolate." The culmination of 2.5 chapters of rebuke is that what was once the house of God, symbolizing God's presence with the Jewish people, has been handed over to them. It's now their house, and God is no longer with them. Jesus has made it abundantly clear that God is setting Israel aside. He says this real explicitly right from the beginning, Matthew 21, verse 43. "Therefore I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce its fruit." You, Israel, will no longer be the custodians of God's hope and truth, Jesus says. That right and that responsibility and that privilege has now been handed over to the church. People who put their faith in Jesus Christ as the Messiah and the Son of God, crucified and risen to new life by the power of God. Now, Israel's been set aside. Jesus makes that very clear for this time period, but there is still hope for Israel. They have sort of been shifted for this era, but in Romans chapter 11, the scriptures tell us that at some point, Through faith in Christ, they will be grafted back in. God will bring them back into his plan to accomplish his will and purposes in this world. But that's down the road. That's going to happen later. We're not to that point of the story yet. Now we're at the point of the story where Jesus has just pronounced that Israel has been set aside. It's Wednesday, the final week of Jesus' life, and he's been saying all of these things very publicly in the temple. Then at the beginning of chapter 24, we learn that Jesus leaves the temple and he starts to head out of town, and he goes west to the top of a hill called the Mount of Olives, just outside the walls of the city, a place where you can see the city, where you have a full view of the temple. And from this point, Jesus now, at this point, he's talking only to his 12 disciples. All of chapter 24, it's not a public pronouncement. It's like a little small group. And we get this sort of insider's view into this little small group discussion and conversation and discourse that Jesus offers just his closest guys. And understand this, as we enter chapter 24, just know this about 24, because it can be confusing and people can interpret it in some weird ways. This is what it's not. It is not Jesus doing a round of end times trivia. This is not like, hey, you know what, guys, we got some time to kill before I go to the cross. Let me just give you some interesting facts about the end times. You know, if you just happen to get on Jeopardy and the category just happens to be end times, here are some useful answers that you want to make sure to phrase in the form of a question. That is not what Jesus is doing here at all. He is not trying to sort of, entertain Alex Trebek. What Jesus does is he launches into a message for his disciples, for his people, for his church, as a means of preparing and equipping them for the age in which they will live, the age in which we are now entering, the end times era. This is a very pastoral conversation that Jesus has with his disciples. He's preparing and equipping them to be the people that God longs for them to be in such a time as this. Now, I want to pause for just a second here and do just a little bit of sort of big picture theology. Are you up for that this morning? Just a little bit of that? It doesn't matter. I'm going to do it anyway. But are you up for it? Okay. All right. There are a few different understandings, a few different sort of vantage point views, interpretations of Matthew chapter 24. I'm going to sum those up into sort of three main views. Now, I want to say really carefully before I throw these views out that there are a lot of very smart, well-meaning, Jesus-loving Christians that hold all of these views, and they are not essential issues. These are not issues worth dividing the church over, having throwdown fights over. People can hold opposing views here and coexist even in the same church. That's perfectly okay. Even on the same elder board, I'd add. So that's perfectly fine. It's great discussion, but it's nothing to get real dogmatic about. And I see a lot of evidence in all three of the points. And at various points in my spiritual journey have sort of entertained all three of these in some way. And I'll tell you where I'm at in a minute. But I just want to give you a sort of a brief general outline of the 3 points, the 3 approaches to Matthew 24. The first one's this. Matthew 24 describes the events surrounding 70 A.D. That's the first perspective. That what Jesus says in this chapter is a prediction of what already happened back in 70 A.D. when the Romans came and completely destroyed the city of Jerusalem and literally burned it and knocked the temple to the ground. We talked about that event in some detail a couple weeks ago if you were here. And the people who hold this view that all that Jesus says already happened, it's been fulfilled back then, these people are called preterists. Not because it's a bad word, it's just the name they give this view, preterists, okay? That's the first view. Second view can be labeled futurist, the futurist view. And it's sort of the opposite of preterism. Futurists believe that what Jesus says in this chapter will be largely fulfilled in the future, right? That's right. The title sort of gives it away. In the future. And that this whole chapter and everything that Jesus says here is really mostly about what's going to happen at the end of the world when Jesus comes for the second time. That's the futurist view. And then there's the third view, and again, I'm generalizing here because there's a lot of variations of these views, but the third view is sort of a combination of views 1 and 2. It's the idea that Jesus does, in this chapter, talk about some very specific events that happened back in 70 AD, but at the same time, he's also referencing some future events that will happen at the end of the world and throughout this entire era. Okay? So that's the three sort of general views, and as we jump in, I just want to be real straightforward with you that I'm sort of preaching this passage from the perspective of view number 3. That's currently what I believe. That's currently what I'm seeing in Scripture. And I say currently because we're all sort of growing and evolving and changing here. But I just see a lot of evidence for a both and here. And you'll see that as we sort of go along. I'm a view 3 guy. I see some statements about 70 AD. I also see some more sort of eschatological statements and an undertone of eschatology. Now, eschatology, that's just sort of a fancy word. We're going to learn a couple fancy words this morning, so you can do some good like name word dropping at parties and stuff and seem really Bible smart. Don't do that. The word eschatology is just a fancy theological word that means study of the last things or events of the end times. So you say if something is eschatological, it refers to the end times or the era of the end times. And I believe what Jesus is doing here is he uses the specific events of 70 AD to sort of paint a picture of what the entire era will look like, and more specifically, to give us a snapshot of what it will look like when that entire era culminates at the end of the world as we know it. That's the title of our sermon series. Okay. Last week, Brian, and we'll talk more about Brian later, he talked about birth pains a bit. One of the reasons why I sort of hold this view is that Jesus says in verse 8, these are the beginnings of birth pains. In other words, in the coming age, the age that's just being ushered in right now, you will see birth pains. Time and time again, this world is going to have contractions of sorts, and there is going to be pain and wars and rumors of wars and famines and earthquakes, all things that characterize this entire era, because those things have been happening ever since Jesus said this, right? And they continue to happen today. That's why one of the reasons why I think this is sort of an era describing chapter, not just a moment. There are definitely some moments, but there's an entire era here as well. It's called the interadvental era. That's another cool word I learned this week. Interadvental. Now, interadvental just means the era between the advents. The first advent being what? When Jesus was born in Bethlehem. That's right, little Christmas trivia. In a manger. Very good. Not good. So that's the first advent. And then the second advent is when he comes again at the end of time in glory and power, and sort of the world as we know it sort of ends finally. So we're in the interadvental era, the era between the two advents. That's the era Jesus describes in this chapter. And one of the major birth pains, one of the major contractions of that era, perhaps the very first major contraction of that era, happened in 70 AD. Now, by referencing 70 AD, another thing that Jesus does, why does he spend time on this one particular sort of contraction event? Here's why I think he does that. To gain credibility. Now, Old Testament prophets did this all the time. They would reference an event in the near future, and they would predict and give details about an event in the near future to get credibility for their predictions about events in the far off future. Because think about it. If you were a prophet, if you were predicting something, and you're predicting something for thousands of years, I mean, no one could ever prove you right or wrong, you know? 3,000 years from now, aliens will land on Earth. And you guys are like, I don't think you're right. And I'm like, prove it. Or I think he's right. Prove it. There's no way to prove it. There's no credibility built in. But when you predict an event that's in the near future, when that event comes true and it happens just as you say, now there's credibility built into all your future predictions. So Jesus, he predicts some things about 70 AD, some things that the people he's talking to will see and experience, some things that his church will read about and study. That's us. And then now we can say, he was right about that event. He's probably right about the future events. Now, most of us think, well, we already believe that anyway, right? But not everybody did in the first century. So Jesus builds in some credibility. And from that place of credibility, Jesus tells us in our passage today in Matthew 24 how to respond as people of the interadvental era, how to respond when the sin and evil of these times rise up, how to respond when birth pains come our way, when contractions happen in this world that we live in. All right? So he's telling us about all that so far, just intro today. All right? It's okay to just go, no, it's just like, we're fired up. This is good stuff today. Okay, here we go. Matthew chapter 24, starting in verse 15. I'm going to read the entire passage if you would just follow along with me. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of his house. Let no one in the field go back to get his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, there he is out in the desert, do not go out, or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. Well, that's pretty straightforward, isn't it? So, just one thing about sort of prophetic literature is it's not meant to necessarily be crystal clear. It's sort of on purpose meant to be just a little fuzzy. You can never quite fully focus it. So we're going to try and focus it as much as possible today and take some practical points for us out of this passage. But some of the things will just sort of linger, and that's okay. And that's okay. This section starts with Jesus referencing something called the abomination that causes desolation. And he says real explicitly here, it's a reference to the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, he uses some imagery to describe the end of the world. Verse 21, where he says, this is as bad as it's going to get, and it's never going to be this bad again. That's another phrase out of the book of Daniel, sort of as Daniel talks about the end times. And some of those phrases, those two phrases, they also apply, ironically enough, to AD 70 on a lesser level. In AD 70, it's interesting to note that at the very beginning of that conflict, it all started in 66 AD, 33 years after Jesus was crucified on the cross. The Zealots, the sort of radical Jewish political party, they took control of the city of Jerusalem. One of the first things they did after gaining control of that city from the Romans is they went into the temple and they slaughtered the priests in the temple. Now, that's kind of strange, isn't it? You think about, why would they do that? They're Jews, the priests were Jews, they take over control back from the Romans, and then they slaughter the priests in the temple. Here's why. What political party were the priests a part of? Anyone know? They were Sadducees. They were Sadducees. Remember that? There's Pharisees and Sadducee. You don't want to be a Sadducee because there's always Sadducee. Remember Sunday school? Okay. They weren't just Sadducee. They were co-conspirators with the Romans. The reason they were able to have control of the temple is because they were willing to collaborate with the Romans. That's how they gained their religious power. The Romans gave it to them because they worked with the Romans. The Zealots hated the Romans. And so when they took control, the first thing they did was to take out anybody who had cooperated with the Romans at all. So they go into the temple and they kill the priests in the temple. And if you were a Jew in first century Israel, that would have been nothing short of an abomination, right? And what does Jesus say? When you see the abomination that leads to desolation, run. And it's no accident that in the first century, the prophets of that day, as soon as this event took place, were saying to the people of Jerusalem, get out of here, because it's going to get ugly. It's going to get bad. And I think, again, that's just a snapshot of what's going to happen throughout this era and ultimately at the end of the world. Verse 16, Jesus says, then, after this happens, let those who are in Judea flee. Now, the word flee in this verse is the Greek word fugo. It's where we get our English word fugitive. It comes from fugo. And the image I just couldn't get away from here. Jesus says, when you see this happening, when there are abominations that are going to lead to desolation, when things go down that abhor God, you flee, you run, you act like a fugitive, and you get out of there. Remember the Harrison Ford movie, The Fugitive? Any seers of that movie in this room, right? Some of you remember, and you don't have to raise your hand because this probably means you're old, the television show upon which that movie was based. I never saw that. I'm just much too young. But there's the movie, The Fugitive. Eddie, you remember it, don't you? And Harrison Ford, he plays the fugitive, and Tommy Lee Jones is after him. And remember this scene. He's been running, and all of a sudden Tommy Lee Jones has him cornered, and he's standing on the edge of this like pipe where the water pours out into this waterfall. He's either going to turn himself in to Tommy Lee Jones and be captured, or he's going to hurl himself out. Remember this scene right here? It's kind of fuzzy. I couldn't find a clear picture on the internet. But he hurls himself out over. What's he do? He hurls himself like hundreds of feet down this waterfall into the river. That's how desperately he did not want to be captured. And Jesus says something very similar here. He says, when sin and evil start to well up such that they are going to lead to something that's abhorrent before God, you flee, you run like a fugitive, you do everything you possibly can not to be associated or connected with that sin. Real practically, friends, point number one is simply this: flee from sin. Flee like a fugitive, like you desperately want to get away from it. Flee from sin. And friends, every single person in this room has got those places of sin, those places where we're vulnerable and weak and tempted to compromise. And so often, in this era that we live in, as God's people, under the grace of Christ, we don't flee from sin, we dabble in sin. We toy with it, and we get as close as we possibly can to it, and then we justify it. And we even sort of enjoy getting as close to the line as we can possibly get. Sin, friends, that God takes real seriously. And we mess around with it. Sexual sin and substance abuses. Those are the ones we always think of. But along with those, pride and self-reliance and greed and materialism and gossip and slander and selfishness and anger and resentment and bitterness, things that we just allow to remain a part of our lives. And we know that we should be completely divorced from these sorts of activities and attitudes, but instead we just engage them just a little. Kind of reminds me of the old youth ministry story. Doug, you probably told this one of the two high school boys who come to their dad and they say, "Dad, there's this movie, and it's rated R, but we really want to see it, and it's really good, and it's just sort of barely rated R, and there's just a teeny tiny bit of violence in it, there's just a teeny tiny bit of sexuality, and there's just a little smidgen of cussing, and so it's not really that big of a deal, so can we please, Dad, go see this movie?" And the dad thinks about it for a second and says, "Let me think about it. Why don't you guys go play and come back, and I'll let you know in a little bit." And the boys go off, and they're like, "Yes, Dad's going to even consider this? I can't even believe he's going to consider it." And the dad, after a time, calls the boys back in. He's in the kitchen, and he says, "All right, boys, I have good news for you. You can go see the movie if you're willing to eat one of these homemade brownies I just made." And the boys are like, "Yeah, this is rad. We're in." And they're just about to dig into the brownies. And the dad says, "Well, hey, before you take a bite, just let me tell you that I put a secret ingredient into the brownies." And they say, "Well, what do you mean a secret ingredient?" He says, "I just added a little something extra this time. Just a teeny, tiny, hardly any of it secret ingredient." And they say, "Well, what's the secret ingredient?" And Dad says, "Dog poop." "What?" He says, "Yeah, it's just a teeny bit. It's not that much. It's just a small amount, and it's baked in, and all the germs are dead. But you know what? Go ahead, just dig in. Have a brownie, and then you guys can go see the movie." And the boys are like, "This is gross." But then they catch the point of their father, right? God says, don't even mess with the teeny, tiny smidgen of sin in your life, friends. Don't get entangled in things that will lead to desolation, that will ruin your life. Because, you know what, friends? The biggest sins, the greatest sins, the sins that entangle us and tear us down, they always start with just a smidgen. You see, friends, I'm guilty of that one too. And sometimes we don't understand how seriously God takes sin in our world. In fact, in this passage, Jesus, he just tries to just cram this point home. Most of this passage is Jesus just pounding this point. He makes this series of statements. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. They used to go on their rooftops. They had flat rooftops. They'd grow vegetables up there and dry them, and they'd even use the rooftops as a place of prayer. And there'd always be sort of an entrance back into the home. There's always an outer staircase that led straight outside down to the ground. And Jesus says, this is such an urgent matter. You don't even have time to go back down through the house. And then he says, let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. And the field workers of that day would wear their cloaks in the morning because it was cool, sort of like Ventura, really. And then as the day progressed, it would get warmer, and they would take their cloaks off and lay them by the side of the field. And Jesus says, you don't even have time to go to the side of the field and grab your cloak. This is such an urgent matter. Just go. Just get out of there. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. This is such a serious time and issue that you're not even going to be able to care for the people that you love the most. And in 70 AD, there are just some horrific stories of what happened to pregnant women and their babies. I won't share those here this morning. He says, pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. In winter, all those dry creek beds in Israel, they'd all fill with water. And that would impede your travel. And he says, if your travel is impeded in any way, you're not going to have time, because this is of the most serious, urgent nature. And he says, on the Sabbath, pray it's not the Sabbath, because on the Sabbath you weren't allowed to ride horses or mules or donkeys. And even your sort of length of travel by foot was sort of restricted. And Jesus says, if you are restricted in any way, you need to flee from the sin. This is massively serious. And of course, he's talking about the event of 70 AD and getting out of Jerusalem. And of course, he's talking about the end times when just fleeing from the evil that will well up during that time period is so crucial. And at the same time, I believe there's a message for us in this about how we should flee and how seriously we should take fleeing from the sin that we face in our world every day. Now, before I move on to this point, I just have to address a particular sin that was revealed in last week's sermon. Brian, who gave a fabulous message, but upon listening, I just don't think I don't listen when I'm not here. I'm checking up. And upon listening back, amidst the tremendous blessing of his word, I discovered a particular sin, the sin of envy, particularly the sin of envying my hair that was brought out. And I've never been more paranoid about my hair than I was this morning getting ready. Thank you, Brian, for that. But I thought, you know what, just because Brian was struggling with that so much, out of just kindness and love, grace, I just thought we should give Brian some hair today, you know? Just thought, there it is. Hey. Remember he talked about trying to grow hair? That's what it would have looked like if he'd have tried. But then I thought, you know what if we just kind of got creative? That's what I'm talking about. I mean, and then I don't know, if that didn't work, maybe this one would just give him a little street cred. He'd have a little more credibility with those folks he's dealing with as an officer. I don't know. Well, thank you, Brian, for your encouraging remarks about my hair last week, and I'll leave it at that. Point one, flee from sin. And I'm going to flee from that right now. Point two, resist the temptation to turn to worldly security. One thing you'll notice if you read chapter 24, and just maybe read it a couple times through, you'll notice that time and time again, Jesus warns of being deceived by false messiahs or false saviors. It comes up 3 or 4 times throughout this one chapter. Watch out that no one deceives you. Verse 4, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. Verse 11, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. If anyone says to you, look, here is the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it, for false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive. It's like this theme throughout this chapter. These sort of false saviors are just going to sort of emerge all over the place. And here is why I believe Jesus is so adamant about this particular warning. Friends, when we find ourselves in times of pain and suffering and despair and desperation, it can be so easy to turn and rely on anything or anyone that promises us instant relief. I mean, when you are hurting, when you are desperate, when things are hard, and it does not seem that there is an end in sight, and God does not seem to be answering your prayers, and someone else or something else comes along that offers you relief from that suffering, it is so tempting to turn. And instead of keeping your hope in God, to place your hope and trust in someone or something else. And some of you this morning, you can relate to that because you're here today and you're going through something big. And from your vantage point, there's a birth pain and there's a contraction happening in your world. And maybe in the face of that, you are tempted to turn and grab a hold of something else, something besides God that will promise to bring relief. And I believe this passage today wants to challenge us and warn us and encourage us and remind us and help us to keep our ultimate hope and faith in God. Even when it gets tough, even when it does not seem that God is listening or that he cares, this passage says that he does, and this passage calls us to continue to put our faith and hope in him. In this passage, Jesus doesn't just say flee from. He very specifically says flee to. He says, where do you say flee to? He says flee to the mountains. Now, again, obvious reference to the hill country around Jerusalem and even the mountains to the north where the residents of Jerusalem would flee to find shelter and refuge from the Roman army. I think there's something to that. It's very practical. Yet I also see a very spiritual point that Jesus makes here for you and me. Because mountains in the Bible almost always and very often refer to refuge and a sanctuary and trusting God and finding hope in him. Over and over and over again, God reveals himself where? On the mountaintop. It's all throughout the scriptures. Think about Jesus in the transfiguration. Think about Moses on the mountaintop. And in this passage, we certainly hear the words of David in Psalm 121. I lift my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And so Jesus issues a very strong call here. He says, as the birth pains of this era come, and as times get difficult, and as you face situations that seem perhaps at times unbearable, resist the temptation to find security and quick, easy fixes. Instead, keep your eyes and keep your hope and keep your trust and keep your security rooted firmly in the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Because, and here's why, and here's how the whole thing sort of culminates today in our section, verse 28. This is perhaps my favorite verse of the entire chapter. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. It's like a life verse for me. This is an awesome verse, and you guys think I'm weird right now, but I'm telling you, this is rad. Jesus is declaring something so powerful here. What he's saying is he's using these simple words to say, in the face of the enemy, know that that enemy will be defeated and disgraced someday. You see, in the ancient world, it was a horrific way to die, to be eaten by animals. Vultures were the worst of the animals. It was a terrible fate. It was symbolic of complete and utter defeat if your body was not buried and you were devoured by animals, the worst of which were vultures. In fact, remember the story of David and Goliath? Remember that story? You guys remember, right? Sunday school? David, Goliath. David's the hero in that story, which is why I like that story. But David comes and he's part of, he's a kid. And the Philistines are on one hill and God's people are on the other hill. And then this giant Goliath, this huge man, which is sort of weird because I'm huge and I always had to play Goliath when I was a kid because I'm still sort of scarred by, I was David, but I had to play Goliath. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. So Goliath comes down from the Philistine camp. He's this huge 9-foot man. He says, send one man and we will fight and decide the fate of our nations, right? And no one wants to go down and fight him until David shows up on the scene, this kid, and he says, I'll go fight him. And he goes down into the valley and Goliath comes down with all of his battle armor. And as they get close closer, Goliath sees David and he starts to size him up, and he realizes that he's just a kid. And Goliath all of a sudden just gets this so confident. And this is what he says in 1 Samuel 17:44. He says, "Come here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." In other words, Goliath says, I'm going to defeat you so fully that you will be utterly disgraced. And it doesn't go that way, does it? And Jesus uses this verse in Matthew 24 to say to his disciples, remember, church, remember, followers, when the birth pains begin and life is hard and it feels like the enemy is winning the day, flee from sin and resist temptation to turn to worldly security. Instead, run to God. In the midst of all of that, you can have utter and complete confidence in God's ultimate victory. Because surely as the vultures circle the sky, the Lord's enemies will be devoured by them, friends. That's what Jesus is saying here. And one of the ways that God helps us remember that, as a community, as a family, as people who will face the struggles and contractions and birth pains of this world, as he says, come together. Come together as followers of mine. Come together as the family of God and share this meal and declare and remember again that the victory has been won. That I went to the cross, that I died your death, and that I was raised again by the power of God to new life. Remember, the enemy will be defeated. We will declare that this morning.